Welcome back, everybody.
We're back for round two, and we're here again with another Beatles album. As everybody should be aware, if you haven't been living underneath a rock like Tyler for the last how many decades, it has been 50 years ago today since Sgt. Pepper taught the band to play. And you guessed it,
going in and out of stuff.
we were talking about the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This album turns 50 years old today, and it was re-released June 1st, 1967.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday to Sgt. Pepper's. Also, interesting kind of tidbit. It was recorded from November the 24th, 1966 up through April 21st, 1967. So they put a lot of time, kind of a little bit more so than the last one, Abbey Road, into doing like final production and mixing
It was like a
with
whole
this
month.
album. It was a little about almost like 6 weeks.
Yeah, roughly.
Depending on what part of the world you were in, would depend on what record label the album was released on. If you were in the UK, you got a copy on Parlophone Records. If you were in the US, it was released on Capitol Records. And it's actually, I have a copy of the original 1967 pressing from the United Kingdom.
Look at that, and it's shiny
And-
goodness.
You can kind of...
It's a beautiful piece right there.
But-
Truly a beautiful piece.
Talking about this, it even has Made in Great Britain, 1967 Parlophone record. It was packaged in this weirdly kind of colored
Two-tone looking.
psychedelic. You go from like dark red to white. Mine's a little beaten up and battered, but I guess we're really kind of getting into like the psychedelic period of the Beatles.
I think, if anything, we're leaving it with Sgt. Pepper, because if you look at the way that starts, from the bottom, working your way up to the top.
Well, no, compared to the rest of their catalog, I mean, we're really going into the psychedelic period of the Beatles. I mean, Revolver, the album prior to this, kind of lent notices about this, but as far as like Sgt. Pepper's going in the Beatles lineup, we're really progressing into more psychedelic type stuff. And we also have to remember that this is the period of time where the Beatles decided that they were going to quit touring. They weren't going to tour anymore. They kind of got tired of Beatlemania and having to go on stage with subpar equipment where they couldn't hear themselves over crazy fans, and it was just a period where they kind of solely made the decision to become pure studio acts. And with that decision came across with a bunch of other type things where they could create sounds and they didn't have to worry about replicating anything live, because they weren't going to play live anymore at this point, at least to them. Another interesting thing that came with this album was this neat little, I don't know, you want to call it cutout type thing. It's just mostly on like a sheet of cardboard, but I guess they were basically telling you to cut them out. I mean, you'd have to take like a pair of scissors or a knife blade to it, but you could cut the little tiny things out, and you have like a Sgt. Pepper's mustache.
You could essentially walk around with a mustache like Sgt. Pepper.
Cut that little part out and like put it up between your nostrils, but here's like a closer thing if anybody hasn't exactly seen it before.
Now, the version of the album I actually have also came with that, and mine was a second pressing, I believe it was, of the album.
Yours, the one that I gave you?
Yes.
That was from like 1987.
Okay, so yeah, that was more like a third pressing thing. But yeah, it actually also came with that as well. I think it was just a different color cardboard. I think mine is essentially yellow. But it's definitely a good album. Definitely a good album.
That's the original right there.
You know, it's glorious, glorious fade.
Another interesting aspect to this album is that they released it in this sort of cutout type thing where you open it up and get rid of Tyler.
That's a good thing. We want that.
Had a nice picture, and it also
has a picture on the back of them as well.
Released lyrics to the front.
Now, was this the first Beatles album to do that, or no?
That was very uncommon to include lyrics on like any kind of album
back then
whatsoever.
Yeah.
So that was like an extra incentive
for people to,
or that was, you know, unusual at the time. Because nowadays, you know, if you go and buy like, let's say a CD, you know, you're getting lyrics in the album liner booklet. You know, where before you just didn't get lyrics, where now it was you could sit down, listen to the song, and go around through with the words and kind of sit there. The producer, well, essential to every just about Beatles record, it's George Martin. He's more or less referred to by some as like the fifth Beatle. And there's not very much more to say about George Martin, or Sir George Martin. I'm sorry. He was knighted.
Yeah, way to piss people off.
But that wraps up kind of like, you know, the introduction part, and we'll go straight back into, you know, track by track listing. The beginning part, side A of the album, opens up with a song sung by Paul McCartney called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and it quickly segues into another song that was sung lead vocals from Ringo called With a Little Help from My Friends. And it was really within these two songs that the Sgt. Pepper's kind of idea was centered around. I think that they were trying to release or make the whole album be a concept of the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. But really, when you look at the other tracks on this album, they kind of don't really have anything to do with the concept of a Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. After that kind of two-part introduction songs, we get into probably one of John's most controversial song titles, which is Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And he did get kind of a little bit of a flack by...
Oh, it's got LSD.
It's, you know, it's LSD, you know, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. That song is...
essentially about drugs.
Yeah. And it kind of is. It's a little weird. I mean, John was like this witty kind of wordsmith where he would write things just to see like how people would kind of, you know, take them. Almost like he didn't have a filter, but he tried very, very hard to kind of, you know, put innuendos and stuff like that. And I don't think, after like reviewing interview footage stuff with him, that, you know, he accidentally or like intentionally named this song so that each letter corresponded
symbolized
with LSD. It was just basically a picture that his son Julian had drawn in school about Julian's friend Lucy, and she was flying through the sky and there was diamonds all around her. I mean, that's the story that John gave out, which, you know, kind of makes sense, but really kind of
imagination, yeah.
Kind of really goes to show that, you know, there's a lot of people that kind of wanted to poke around with his stuff, and he had fun with that idea later on.
And we're probably going to have some people who stumble upon this video not knowing what LSD is, and if you don't know what LSD is, shame on you.
Look it up. There's another YouTube channel for that.
Yeah, but no, essentially what LSD is it's a drug. You essentially take and you trip. Like, you see some shit that is not there. So, and the way that John is essentially poking fun at LSD with Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, it's basically stating that, now this is my own personal opinion, so again, y'all don't like it, you don't like it, you like it, you like it. But well, my personal opinion with this part is like, you know, he makes fun of drug use, and you know, we can
he
personally
doesn't really
say,
make fun of it, but I think it was taken out of context by people.
Yeah, but
that
like
he did,
and we
really didn't.
We both know the Beatles essentially dropped acid at some point.
Well, at this point in time, John and George had become
acid heads,
using acid fairly regularly.
Every other hour.
And Paul basically came out with an interview where he stated that, you know, that they do acid.
Well, yeah, I mean,
and I think there's even like a pretty cool story where the one time, I think it was during the Sgt. Pepper's recording sessions where John had dropped acid, but nobody, like George Martin, the producer, he didn't know because he essentially kind of didn't accept that kind of stuff in the studio. So John had dropped acid and was going on this bad trip, and George Martin had thought that he was kind of, you know,
possessed.
Well, he wasn't possessed, but he was like, you know, sick, or almost to the point where I think they eventually wound up on the rooftop of Abbey Road Studios, and which is kind of a bad idea to begin with, you know, if you're doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah, if you're
on a rooftop.
If you're on acid and you climb up to a rooftop, it is not the wisest choice in the world. Anyway, let's move on to some more information about the album and the band.
After Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, we get into a Paul McCartney song, Getting Better. It's not a whole lot really to this song. I mean, lyrics express a lot of, you know, positivity, and then you have John writing the middle 8, or the bridge, where he talks about, you know, Paul says it's getting better all the time, and then you have John, you know, it can't get much worse. So they're kind of, you know, going back and forth there. It's an interesting, you know, dynamic still from the Lennon-McCartney songwriting dynamic. After that, Fixing a Hole, and She's Leaving Home, and Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. Now, this is where we kind of really start to get into the psychedelic kind of stuff to it, because
yeah, we do.
we're adding like weird, like seesaw type like things, sounds, and you're getting sound effects and outside, you know, music that is not the standard, you know, guitar, drum, bass setup of the Beatles. I mean, you're kind of getting what would be referred to today as like synth sounds, you know, where they sit down, load up a synthesizer, and just play these different kind of things. And that basically takes up the first side. Side 2 begins with George Harrison's really kind of maybe only involvement in the songwriting contribution to this album, which is Within You, Without You, and it's a rather interesting kind of song within itself. I mean, we're starting to get kind of into simplicity with George, and kind of with his Indian music and the ideas that, you know, we're all one, and that, you know, life flows on within you and without you. It's an interesting kind of, you know, dynamic or
I actually
concept.
Sort of interrupt you there for a second, buddy, but I actually have a little piece of tidbit information about that, the whole Indian music style and stuff. So whenever we get to that, I don't know if you already know this or not, but anyway, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, if you want to continue doing what you're doing, and I'll save that little piece of tidbit for the 5 facts.
That's fine.
Okay, well, today we're only gonna have 4 facts because, well, I'm giving you one.
This
now.
is one extra fact.
Yeah, this is like
an early fact.
Yeah, this is a little bonus thing for its the 50th anniversary, 50th birthday, or whatever you want to call it. George Harrison was barely a part of the album. Like he was very hardly involved with the album due to the fact that he was getting real heavy into like the Indian style music and everything like that. And at one point, he actually didn't like the idea of them dressing up in the Sgt. Pepper gowns. He said that he found it to be, trying to think of a decent word to say here. He basically found it to be embarrassing because he was like, essentially, studying the Indian religion. He's studying their music, studying like a lot of their beliefs and everything else, and he basically kind of found it offensive that they were doing this. But yeah, I mean, like that was a little piece of information I figured I'd share kind of early on. So I'll let Josh continue doing his thing.
Other than that, we kind of get back into your standard kind of B-side album songs. When I'm 64, Lovely Rita, Good Morning, Good Morning. Kind of going along with, Getting Better, Fixing a Hole, when She's Leaving Home. They're okay songs, but it's more or less, I think, kind of filler. And then we get to the Sgt. Pepper's Reprise, where they kind of go back and redo it a little bit in a faster tempo, and not quite exactly the same song, hence a reprise, which that gives way into probably the nicest sounding song on the album, which is A Day in a Life, which features
suicide at one point.
You have John Lennon's song and a Paul McCartney song morphed into each other, like to not create one huge song. They took John's song where he had verses to stuff, then they segued into this huge orchestral progression to get to Paul's song. And then after that, they went back into a verse for John and then ended it with this huge and even more immense sense of orchestration, where I forget who it said, but George Martin had originally wanted it to sound like a complete orgasm of sound. So it starts off where you hear almost nothing, and then the volume raises and you add more and more and more, and then it gets up to that point, and then it hits with that huge E chord, E major. And from there it fades out, and depending on what kind of version of the album you have, there's some weird little like sound effects that occur after that. Mm-hmm. Some of the other ones, like I know if you on my CD version it has that, but I don't think on my LP version they included that kind of thing. I think it just gets cut off after a certain point. I
know the LP that you gave me of it actually has the sound effects on it. Along with
it's like a lot of
it's
weird stuff played backwards.
It's kind of just like some wacky stuff played backwards, and just different stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, when it came to the album, that there was gonna be some weirdness behind it. I mean, especially with the name Sgt. Pepper, because back then when artists were making albums, they were subtle titles. They were, something just short and easy, and just.
Well, you look at like some of the earlier Beatles stuff. I mean, you have Help, Revolver.
Yeah, but like
titles that are kind of very simplistic, and
they were simplistic, but they had like a meaning to it, or of some sorts, like some sort of subliminal message. But I'm talking about like artists. I'm not really sure who was around or like making music around this time.
Bob Dylan. Yeah,
besides Bob Dylan, because I'm not a Dylan fan. That's right, I said it. I don't like Bob Dylan. But no, like it's just different artists. They had simplistic titles that meant something to them or meant something to their fans, like as an homage to something that they did earlier or something like a little wink to an old title of a song or something like that. And but with Sgt. Pepper's, like, it kind of just came out of nowhere. And but yeah, it's definitely an interesting title for an album, and it's definitely got to be one of the longest titles. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
It's a mouthful.
It's definitely a mouthful, and I noticed a lot of people just abbreviate it Sgt. Pepper's because it's a lot easier to say. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely, you know, it's a weird album, but it's also good. And it has its moments where it's one of the best sounding albums I've heard in a while. And then there's moments where it's like, should I get high on acid and then listen to this and maybe make another story? Now, I'm not condoning the usage of drugs, so don't get me wrong. Don't do them, okay?
Do you want to?
Yeah,
like,
do you want
like,
to?
You know, what would it be like, you know, to experience that? But we don't need to discuss.
Yeah, we don't need to discuss that. Right? I'll tell you after the show. But yeah, I mean, it's something like with this album, it's definitely an experience. It takes you on a ride where you didn't expect to go with.
It's also like don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure it's like the first concept album. I mean, the Beach Boys had Pet Sounds,
mm-hmm.
and the Beatles drew a lot off of Brian Wilson's sounds from the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds.
Right.
But I think like Sgt. Pepper's is
essentially the first concept album.
It's the first album that is revolved around a concept instead of just a bunch of songs put together.
Now, I'm trying to remember David Bowie's Ziggy Stardust. That was also a concept album. I'm trying to remember what year that came out because I think it might have been around the same time, maybe after. I think it was before, definitely after Sgt. Pepper, but that was also considered to be a concept album. And if we ever do a David Bowie episode, I'll explain the concept behind that one. Hell, I might even do it after this episode. But because I kind of want to focus more around the Beatles.
We digress.
Yeah, I kind of want to focus more around the Beatles since it being the 50th birthday of Sgt. Pepper's, and then instead of going into like a concept of Bowie, because I'll talk about Bowie for fucking hours on end. You know that as well.
So how about your 5 facts? We're
four facts now. So we did 1 fact earlier, so I got 4 fun facts for you guys today about Sgt. Pepper's. Number 1 being the whole concept of the idea actually began over dinner. Essentially, Paul McCartney wanted to make an anonymous album. Like, he wanted to still make a Beatles album, but he wanted the Beatles to be anonymous. So he was sitting down with a friend of his having dinner, and he made a joke about the salt and pepper shakers. Having the, you know how the old style ones have like the S for salt, P for pepper. And he made a joke saying, Sgt. Pepper's, that would be a name for a band. So essentially, he went to John with the idea of calling the album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And that's essentially how it came to be. Second one. Now, this one I found to be hysterical in a way because this actually has to involve with John's wit. How he's
he was very witty.
He was that witty. He was that wacky Beatle.
Said sarcasm to him.
He was that wacky Beatle.
That was George, the wacky Beatle.
No, you listen here. But, John actually wanted Adolf Hitler on the album cover. And as you notice with the cover of Sgt. Pepper, there's 64 people, I believe, on the cover. Bob
Dylan is one of them.
Yeah, that includes like Bob Dylan, Marilyn Monroe, Marlon Brando, even the 5th Beatle. I believe his name was, I believe his first name was Scuff, last name Scuff, something like that.
Stuart Sutcliffe.
Yes, that. Thank you.
The original bass player.
Yes, him. But after coming up with the idea of Adolf Hitler being on the cover, John was essentially turned down the idea. So John's next idea was, well, why not Jesus? Going back to the whole...
His 1966.
Yeah, his 1966 controversial statement that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus Christ. And that was also denied due to, religious reasonings. Number 3, and this is going to be the last. No, I'm sorry, I have one more after this. George Harrison was barely involved with the album. Wait, I discussed that one, didn't I?
Yeah, he was very absent from the
Yeah,
album.
he was very absent from it. I discussed that one earlier. I had a moment. Too much acid. Too much acid, kids. Don't do it. It'll fry your brain. But Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields were actually supposed to be on this album. Yeah, it was originally, they were originated for the idea, but I believe it was, I'm going to say John, maybe. He didn't like the idea that they were on the album.
I don't know. They just did, and even like looking at it now, they wouldn't have fit with the album. But I think they just, because back then, like a lot of the things, like you had singles, you had albums, and you didn't put a lot.
Yeah.
Of singles on an album, because that was the whole purpose of having it on 45. So I think they just put it on. They released Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane as singles instead of putting it on the album.
Okay, and the last one. Now, I was discussing this with Josh before we started recording, and now there's a lot of controversy behind this one. There's a lot of you can get into a fight with a Beatles fan immediately for starting this. This one is Paul sang the "As" on A Day in the Life. It's been known to actually cause fights whether or not that it was actually Paul who sang it or it was John who intentionally sang that. And it was during the John's dream where it was, I woke up, fell out of bed, dragged the comb across my head.
Well, it's Paul singing that, though.
Yeah, but no, there's also it's also stating that it could have been Paul doing the "as," or it could have been John doing the "as."
It's Paul. I'm just joking with you. It's actually John.
I'm saying it's Paul.
I know.
So.
I know John's voice, and that's John Lennon.
We're gonna have a scrap here.
That is John Lennon singing that.
This video is gonna be cut short because we're gonna be brawling here in a minute. But no,
Paul's voice is too pure.
But no, yeah, I just thought it was interesting that this actually brings fights out of people.
It's gonna cause one right here because
it is.
You can't accept that that's John Lennon's voice.
You want to go? I will knock your ass out. But
I'll call Tony. I'm gonna call Lifeline.
There you go. That's for you. That can stay there. But no, it's essentially yeah, like people got into fights over this shit.
I'm gonna phone a friend.
This isn't Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. But no, like I just thought that was interesting, so I figured I'd talk about it. And those were 4 facts of from Sgt. Pepper's.
It's John.
I heard. Fuck you, man. But yeah, I'm gonna let Josh continue with the rest of this, and then I'll be back to leave some feedback here and there. So take it away, Josh.
Well, basically, we know
asshole.
that our two segments individualized are done. So now it's just more along the lines of
rating
the impact of this album.
Yeah, impact and rating.
You look at there was influence.
Stop playing footsie with me.
Is influenced a lot by the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, and that was kind of like the rivalry between the Beach Boys and the Beatles. One would play off the next one, and you release that. Okay, well, it was like a friendly rivalry of you did that, we're taking that, we're adding this to it. And I think that's kind of where it created like a really nice idea to have like that and kind of back and forth, because not only did you have John and Paul going at it back and forth to kind of like see who was the better songwriter in that impact, but then they had an outside kind of competition to do with Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys. Also talking about the use of orchestration and the psychedelic themes and this stuff. I mean, we're getting to 1967, especially June of 1967. So we're starting the summer of love, in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco with the hippie culture. So, and then you have the Doors, they released their debut album that same year. And
there's a lot of competition.
A lot of that, you think about the psychedelic period of the 1960s. Sometimes compared to that specific kind of genre and time frame, Sgt. Pepper's really doesn't kind of fit to the majority, but you can see traces of influence from the psychedelic rock period of the time. So, and this kind of really created major impact for the band because you look at it, they had stopped touring, they were no longer playing live, so now everything became a studio thing.
Well,
and
didn't they do one last show on top of the Apple Studios roof? Wasn't that near the end of it?
That wouldn't be for another 2 years.
Yeah,
that was just more or less a glorified rehearsal than anything really.
That had people stopping them in the street to listen to. But
if we do Let It Be, that'll be a thing for that. But you'd stopped playing live, so they didn't have to worry about replication. The Beatles became this. You couldn't go out and buy a ticket to see a live show, so it really, the only way you were hearing the Beatles from that point on, from 1967 on, was through a record.
Yep.
So it kind of changed their entire dynamic because they would never go on a full-scale tour as the Beatles ever again. George really didn't care for the hype and everything, and
he was more trying to stay away from the publicity, the hype, and all of that stuff, which, I wouldn't blame him. You've been a member of the Beatles since you were, how old? And,
so he's, 17,
yeah,
18 years old.
He was, 17, or he was a fucking teenager. And being, around the sold-out stadiums and TV and everything else, you essentially just get burnt out from it, and that's what happened with George, and he burnt out, and he just didn't want to do live anymore. He didn't want to sell out the stadiums. He didn't want to be on the television. He didn't want to do stuff like that, and I can honestly respect him for making that choice. I know a lot of people are probably gonna be that comes with the territory of being a musician. You should do live shows and you should be on tour and stuff. No, that's far from it. We're in a band. We don't essentially do a lot of live stuff. We do mostly record it. We mostly do studio stuff. We mostly play recordings. We do stuff like that. It's very seldom that we are live. And when we are live, it's basically Facebook or a couple of the
obscure
usual
shows.
Yeah,
I think it takes a lot, because for a band to be okay, screw it, we're not going on tour anymore.
Yeah,
because let's face it, tour, you're basically turning down money. And in the Beatles kind of days, they didn't really get very much money due to the taxes of the whole thing. They probably didn't get paid a lot for touring, but you still get paid.
And touring also takes a lot out of a band. You look at a lot of these musicians nowadays who go on tours, and then you don't hear from them for 3 years after a tour or something like that. Paramore came out with an album in, what was that, 2012 roughly, and then we haven't heard nothing from them up until recently. They just came out with a new album. Same with the Gorillaz. Christ, the last time I heard anything from the Gorillaz was 2010, and then 7 years later they come out with a new album. and they're starting to tour again. So it takes a lot out of you, you know, musically. And
plus, you know, talking about that, you know, you look at the Beatles, they were like putting out
they were
like an
putting
average of like 2 studio albums out in a year.
Yeah, they were dropping albums left and right. And it takes a lot out of you mentally, emotionally, and everything. Because when you tour, you know, you're away from your family, you're away from your friends, and, you know, you're with these people that are your bandmates, and, you know, you're with them months on end, and it just takes so much out of you because you really don't get to, you know, have, you know, your family, your wife, your girlfriend, your boyfriends, whoever, you know, with you on this tour. And it takes a lot away from you knowing that, okay, I got to spend the next 6 months with these guys, and if we get into a fight, it may be over and we have to cancel this tour, and we're going to have a lot of upset fans. We're going to have a lot of, you know, people against us and everything else like that. And I think, and I can 100% agree with George's decision of not wanting to be a touring band anymore, to be a live band anymore, and to work on the recording. Because I know a lot of the times whenever we do decide to play live or we get a chance to play live, it takes a lot out of us. It mentally drains us. It emotionally drains us because we're there. And, you know,
there's so much stuff to, you know, you have to take care of.
Yeah, there's so much
prep work. And also another thing too, you have to consider, you know, the like pure shit, you know, equipment of the 1960s. I mean, we're not talking about huge amplifiers.
Yeah, no, we're talking like
of today. We're talking, and that was another thing too, where they couldn't hear each other on stage play. Like their monitors would just get drowned out by screaming fans, and, you know, it caused Ringo to have to look at Paul and John's ass, basically to keep time, because they would be doing
a little ditty on stage. But yeah, like, and I could tell you were nodding your head the whole time I was talking about this, and you agree that, you know, it takes a lot out of you being a touring band. And honestly, if the Beatles,
we don't even do it that much.
And you agree, we've done it maybe 3 or 4 times, and it's beat the hell out of us. But and we're not even the Beatles, man. But it definitely takes a number on you guys. And I know we're probably gonna have some people who are in bands, and you guys are gonna be like, oh, they're just a bunch of pussies, you know. It's not that we're, you know, judging people. We're not saying that.
It's just our lifestyle.
Yeah, it's a lifestyle choice, essentially. And I know if George was here today, if he was still around kicking, possibly making more music, he would essentially probably still be, you know, a studio artist. He wouldn't want to do live shows.
Well, even after the Beatles, he didn't want to have to do
a
whole lot of live shows. I mean, like, the first, like, big, you know, live thing that he did was in his, like, concert for Bangladesh.
Mm-hmm.
And even, you know, that kind of scared him.
Oh, absolutely.
And all you had to do was go out there and play, you know, 2 shows, and that was just...
And it was enough to, you know, mess with him. But
anyway...
Let's get back to the album.
Sgt. Pepper's, I mean, we're talking about the impact of this album, you know, here 50 years later.
It's hard to believe, huh?
It still sounds relatively good. I mean, the whole album, it doesn't... You can kind of tell it's dated by, you know, the recording techniques and the psychedelic type stuff, because where they're not really releasing psychedelic music heavily in this particular era. But, you know, you can turn on Sgt. Pepper's, listen from it, from the title track to Day in the Life, and, you know, it still holds up as an album, because apparently, you know, we're still sitting here 50 years later, exactly to the day, listening to it, talking about it. They're releasing the huge box sets and remastered editions and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, in the Beatles catalog, I know it gets a lot of, you know, things where every Beatles album is pretty great, but Sgt. Pepper's, you know, that's a defining thing that you have to look into. it's definitely like an interesting type thing. And then, they would go on to record songs for Magical Mystery Tour, the White Album, Let It Be, and then the previously, reviewed Abbey Road. This was kind of like, the beginning steps from going from Revolver and Rubber Soul to, the White Album. This is the bridge part of their musical ideas.
Existential step into the next phase of the Beatles. Like, there was phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is roughly around phase 3, Abbey Road being phase 4.
This is like more, I would put this album kind of like in the middle of the Beatles' career, where you have like their beginning type stuff where they were kind of like a classic rock and roll type band up until about, Help, Revolver, Rubber Soul, Sgt. Pepper's. You have this one thing. They made it big in America. They started releasing this other stuff. Then it was kind of like a switch from that to this pure studio, where we get Sgt. Pepper's. Then after that, they went to India, became experimental, recorded the White Album, came back and wanted to really kind of, by that point in time, they were deteriorating as a band, as a social band. And, when you think about the beginning of the end of the Beatles, unfortunately, it kind of sounds pretty bad to say it, but it's, Sgt. Pepper's was kind of the beginning to the last stretch to the Beatles catalog.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, I'd have to give Sgt. Pepper's probably about a 3.9 to about 4.1 of a rating out of 5. How about you, Tyler? Where do you classify this?
I'm gonna have to agree the same with you. I mean, like you said, this was the beginning of the end with the Beatles. There was fights going on between them. The drug usage between them wasn't very good for the band. Using drugs while you're in a band is usually never a good thing for the band, because you're always, getting into fights, just for different reasons. And I think that was what was really the downfall of it. Now, we're not saying that we intentionally hate this album because of what we rated it, but it's...
Oh, no, I actually do enjoy this album.
I enjoy it too.
I just don't hold it as nearly as good as, Abbey Road that we discussed
previously
a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, on our previous episode. But yeah, I mean, Sgt. Pepper's a great album. I'll listen to it. I listen to it maybe once every day or so, and it's one of those albums that you can go back to and listen to and enjoy every time. But it's not, one of the best albums made, and it's just because of different reasons, different downfalls. But yeah, I mean, that's really all I can say about it.
But it's the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's.
Yeah.
Lonely Hearts Club Band. So I mean, we
really can't club it to death.
It's the Beatles. I mean, love them or hate them, you have to
at least appreciate.
Yeah, I think that
would be a good term. You have to at least appreciate the Beatles for what they did to the music era and everything else. Because I essentially believe without the Beatles, a lot of the bands that are around today may not have been influenced, and they may not have been the bands that they are, or they may not have found music. Like Kurt Cobain, for example. He was a big fan of the Beatles when he was a kid, and he would used to sing John Lennon songs a lot as a child. And yeah, I mean, like, if the Beatles, didn't become what they were and John didn't become music, we may not have had Kurt Cobain
as
that.
We know him
yeah,
today.
Yeah, or we may not have had him as a musician at all.
Yeah. Well, that's what I mean. Like as we know him today.
Yeah, for the few short years that we did know Kurt, it could have been something completely different. You know, he could have still been alive, but you know, having a 9-to-5 job where he was miserable instead of doing, you know, music.
Being with Courtney Love.
Don't even get me started with her. But yeah, like, you know, because Kurt is Kurt's a big example for me, because if I wouldn't have listened to Nirvana, I wouldn't have gotten into music, and I wouldn't have been in the band that I am in now with Josh and our friend Tony, who yet again is not with us.
Yeah, he's absent.
He's absent again for this show. But we'll try to get him on here one day. He's the prettiest. He's the prettiest one out of us three. But yeah, it's like, you know,
I think that wraps it up pretty nicely.
Yeah. So don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe.
Comment below.
Yeah, comment below. Give us feedback. Tell us what you guys thought of the album. What you guys think of us. If you think we're garbage, tell us, and we'll just keep going just to piss you off.
We'll laugh about it.
We'll laugh about it. We'll have a few rounds. But, yeah. So until the next video, we'll see you guys later. Oh, and
check us out on Facebook.
Yeah, check us out on Facebook. And if you guys have ideas for artists we should cover, you know,
send them our way.
Yeah, talk about on the show, or just you guys want to hear us sing them, you know, send us the links, you know, tell us everything, you know, why you choose that band and shit like that. We would love to hear it. We would love feedback. We always enjoy feedback.
Oh, yeah. And, don't even feel free to, or I guess feel free to do maybe independent stuff or stuff that's kind of, lesser known, because I know we've done 2 Beatles things here.
But,
it might be interesting to kind of get, a
and
less corporate.
I know later on down the road, I actually have a couple albums from indie groups that I would love to discuss with you. I would love to let you sit down and listen to. So yeah, I mean, yeah. So
this has been episode number 2 of, Beneath the Needle, Inside the Albums.
Take my hand, girl, if you want to. Don't go away. Kiss me, girl, when you see me. I can't shy away.